Hello everybody, Kemo Sabi here, coming at you with another video. So this one is off of checkpointasia net. Original sourcing was from Military Watch, with the topic of, and it's going to be a three-part today. We're going to have three short little articles. Maritime tensions with Iran highlight decrepit state of British Royal Navy. Persia isn't exactly shaking in its boots here, published July 27th. Also a side note from my sender, following on the previous post regarding the hollow fragility of the U.S. military. These three short pieces outline in some of the Gordon Duff articles not just the fake nature of such, but their absolute criminal character. But first, the truly pathetic condition of Britain's Navy once the rule of the world's oceans. Flagship is an aircraft carrier without an air wing and has 6 destroyers to Japan's 26. Britain's seizure of an Iranian oil tanker in the Straits of Gibraltar, which was forcefully commandeered by the Royal Marines on July 4th, has provoked a major international incident with Iran by deploying its Revolutionary Guard Corps to seize a British-flagged oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz. After repeated requests from Tehran to release its vessel were refused, Britain has refused to release the Iranian ship in exchange for release of its own, and has responded by threatening a larger military presence in the Persian Gulf near Iranian waters. Key to projecting power so far from British shores and placing military pressure on Iran is the British Royal Navy, which in 2018 acquired a new base in Bahrain near the Iranian coast. The current state of capabilities of the British Royal Navy leave much to be desired, however, bringing its ability to apply pressure against Iran to serious question. With the United States distancing itself from Britain's position regarding the tanker issue, with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo stating that responsibility for resolving this issue falls to the United Kingdom, Britain's ability to follow through on its threats is highly questionable. In terms of combat capability, the British Royal Navy has declined significantly on both sides and reliability. From a fleet of 4 carriers, 13 destroyers, and 47 frigates in the waning years of the Cold War, Britain today fields just a single carrier, 6 destroyers, and 13 frigates. The sole carrier currently in service, HMS Queen Elizabeth, has suffered from serious reliability issues, including a recent leak which forced it to cut its mission short and return to port. The country's Type 45 destroyers are not only increasingly outmatched by those of rival powers such as China and the United States, but also suffer from extreme reliability issues. The warship's Rolls-Royce diesel engines reportedly degrade catastrophically in hot climates, such as those found in the Straits of Hormuz or the waters of Southeast Asia. A fleet of 6 destroyers is considered extremely small for a self-proclaimed Tier 1 military power. The same number of China adds to its fleet annually, and over 85% smaller than Japan's destroyer fleet despite similar levels of spending. The warships are increasingly outgunned both qualitatively and quantitatively by rival powers. With an engagement range of just 124 kilometers against enemy warships and missiles traveling at extremely low subsonic speeds, anti-ship missile capabilities of over 800 kilometers are elsewhere increasingly becoming the norm. Perhaps the greatest shortcoming, however, is the destroyer's extreme maintenance requirement and poor reliability mean that only 2 to 3 warships are ever active at one time. Indeed, whether the Navy would be able to afford operational costs for any more than this remains highly uncertain. Britain's fleet of lighter Type 23 class frigates fares little better than its destroyer fleet, with 6 warships and 13 currently out of service. Many of these warships will be expected to serve for over 35 years before viable replacements are available in the late 2020s. And the vessel has already aged considerably, which increases maintenance requirements and undermines viability against near-peer adversaries. The replacement Type 31 class ships are widely considered converters, and while newer, they were designed primarily to minimize cost and are not considered able to perform at the level of frigates. With the British economy showing no signs of considerable improvement for the foreseeable future, the Navy's current assertively budget is unlikely to change, meaning the decline of the fleet is set to continue indefinitely. As noted by Ian Ballantyne, the Plymouth-based editor of Warships magazine, the oldest Type 23 will be 30 to 35 years old when the Types 26 come in. That is ancient in warship terms. Old ships cost more to keep running and they break down more often. With the rise of Russia and China, instability in the Gulf, and the demands of the Falklands and the other British overseas territories, the Navy half the size it was in 1991. It's a perfect storm. Ultimately, Britain's ability to protect power overseas continues to be seriously degraded, and with considerations currently being made for a reduction in planned acquisitions of F-35B carrier-based fighters and nuclear-powered submarines, this situation could be further exacerbated. In planned, fleet modernization plans, though far from ambitious, have consistently been deemed unaffordable. It is also of note that while Britain does have a single carrier in service, the sole class of fixed-wing aircraft it is able to deploy, the F-35B, is considered very far from combat ready and is unlikely to be several years to come. Thus, even if issues with the carrier itself are amended, the warship HMS Queen Elizabeth will function primarily as a helicopter carrier for combat missions for the foreseeable future. While there was unlikely ever a realistic British military option for taking on Iran, the state of the Royal Navy today means that even prospects for asserting military pressure, though an increased presence in the Gulf, remains highly dubious. Alright, now we have part 2. This is going to be right up from Gordon Duff. Also, the last third will be a Gordon Duff. It's off of GeoNeo.org, 2019-07-27, so it was published the 27th in July, and with the topic of no longer creditable, America's fake military. A short time ago, President Donald Trump threatened to obliterate Afghanistan with nuclear weapons, stating that at the last moment he thought killing millions of innocent people might well be wrong in some way. Here's exactly what he said. If we wanted to fight a war in Afghanistan and win it, I could win that war in a week. I just don't want to kill 10 million people. I have plans on Afghanistan that if I wanted to win that war, Afghanistan would be wiped off the face of the earth. It would be gone. According to legend, the Roman Emperor Caligula planned to name his favorite horse Syndicates, a council of Rome. Historians generally agree, despite Caligula's reputation as perhaps the most despotic and insane ruler in history, the story is unlikely. With Trump, however, the tale is a different one. Trump trumped Caligula in the lunatic category, and did it in front of live television audiences around the world. In general, the media ignored Trump's gaffe and failed miserably to gauge responses around the world, running from incredibility to horror. After all, Trump told the audience, with Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan at his side, that it wasn't his idea in the first place. America talks military power but fails miserably when it plays strongman in Asia and elsewhere. Now moving to softer methods, propaganda, false flag terrorism, fake democratic movements, sanctions, and now utterly insane threats. Are America's threats insane? As America wins battles now and again, but invariably loses war after war after war, is nuclear annihilation of the defenses now the go-to expression of waning American power? Is it insane to threaten wars America is simply military unprepared to fight, threatening nations that are utterly aware the threats that continually come from Trump, Bolton, and Pompeo are not just vacuous but goofy? Donald Trump thus far is 0 for 3 in his attempt to portray himself as a wartime president. First North Korea, then Venezuela, and now Iran, all making a mockery of American invasion threats. Why is this? What is America's real military capacity, and why is a notion that has bankrupted itself throwing money at its defense industry neutered? It didn't start with Vietnam, it's true. 15 years There, stumbling up and down the peninsula once known as Cochin China, was a great military disaster. After losing 20,000 men and controlling over 5% of the country, the then new American President Richard Nixon announced America's surrender under the guise of what Henry Kissinger called Vietnamization. Of course, the Vietnamese were never really taking part in the war, had never built a real army, and hadn't, as the U.S. had done, instituted a program of military conscription. Those in Vietnam who wanted to fight for the country were doing so already. They were called the Viet Cong, and they fought against the United States. Once the Nixon-Kissinger announcement was made that the U.S. would leave, it was no longer necessary for the Viet Cong to hold territory to defend anything. Thus they turned to another tactic, that of slaughtering Americans wherever they found them, killing another 35,000 and wounding 20 times that number. Few are unaware the U.S. lost 5,000 combat aircraft, including helicopters, over Vietnam. For veterans today, do remember we lost 5,000 combat aircraft in Vietnam, including 31 B-52s. The rotting airframes of 500 Phantom IIs are still in Vietnam's jungle. America doesn't have 5,000 aircraft anymore. Add to its 5,200 helicopters lost by the Army alone, 10,000 aircraft. Hey, the U.S. lost 95,000 aircraft in World War II. A figure we lie about also, with deaths in that war twice what we report, well over 1 million. Our losses in Vietnam, depending on stats used, 58K or 1.3 million. When you add the slower Agent Orange deaths, it hits 2.2 million. We can probably go back to the Korean conflict, as it is called now, as with Vietnam. The rationale for U.S. involvement was always misrepresented to the American people as communist aggression. In this case, the Korean people were resisting the continued rule by the remnants of their brutal Japanese occupiers and their quisling leader, Syngman-rhee. While Japan was being demilitarized under U.S. occupation by General MacArthur, quite the opposite was going on in South Korea, with its democratization movement brutally crushed by the CIA puppet government. This, of course, was exactly what happened to Vietnam as well. All part of the Marshall Doctrine established in 1947, intended to surround the Soviet Union and China with free democracies. No matter how brutal or fascistic such democracies actually were, both wars, of course, were losses. Where America's military might, when placed on the ground in Asia, mistakes repeated in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well in latter decades, from the American conservative. On April 28, 1961, a decade after General Douglas MacArthur was fired for defying Harry Truman on Korea, the controversial commander hosted President John F. Kennedy at the New York's Waldorf Astoria Hotel, where MacArthur and his wife lived in a suite on the 37th floor. The contrast between the two could not have been more obvious. MacArthur, then in his early 80s, was mottled, frail, and walked with a slight stoop, while the newly inaugurated Kennedy was young, fit, and vibrant. The two sequestered themselves in MacArthur's suite, then posed for photographers, the young president obviously proud to appear with the aging legend. The meeting itself was the subject of news stories and featured on national newscasts that same day. Later, the meeting provided grist for 2 generations of Kennedy's besotted commenters who debated whether the young president, had he not been assassinated in Dallas, might have recoiled from committing tens of thousands of U.S. troops to a winless war in Southeast Asia. Of course, of action taken by Lyndon Johnson, his successor, it turns out that Kennedy's memo of the Waldorf Astoria meeting, now at Boston John F. Kennedy Presidential Library Museum, is crucial for historians for a number of other reasons. It offers not only a glimpse of how the young president intended to navigate the treacherous waters of the Cold War, but suggests how one of America's most celebrated military officers viewed what might be called the grand strategy of the American Republic, that is, whether and how the U.S. might win its dangerous struggle against the Soviet Union. Finally, the Waldorf-Astoria meeting tells us how MacArthur's most famous warning to never fight a land war in Asia has come down to us. What he meant by that, and whether in an age of American troop deployments in at least 133 countries, it retains its meaning. Such background material begs for historical vignettes. In our first, MacArthur was U.S. co-commander against the Japanese in World War II. His other half, as it were, was Admiral Chester Nimitz. MacArthur, a five-star Army general, commanded ground forces in the larger land campaigns, New Guinea, Burma, the Philippines, and others, while Nimitz commanded the island-hopping campaign. MacArthur fell under criticism for moving slowly and holding down casualties, while Nimitz ran up massive casualties, targeting heavy defended islands that should have been bypassed, like Iwo Jima, among many others. When we look at that period, America's primary ally in Cochin, or Indochina, was the Viet Minh under Ho Chi Minh. In China, the U.S. negotiated cooperation between Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang and Mao's People Liberation Army. Suffice it to say, Mao's forces did 90% of the fighting against the Japanese, while Chiang took his massive U.S. financial aid and bribed dozens of the right-wing U.S. politicians, all of whom were big fans of Adolf Hitler, before the war and to an extent during. In Vietnam, we had a different story, but not so different. Rather than supporting Ho Chi Minh, as the U.S. had promised, as leader of the United Vietnam, the U.S. financed the return of France as a colonial power, gifting France the military hardware then stored on Formosa, intended to be used for land invasion of Japan that never transpired. France chose to use largely foreign mercenaries for this conflict, including thousands of former German SS who had joined the French Foreign Legion in order to avoid war crime tribunals. Germans were always popular for their military prowess, as Chiang had. During his encirclement campaigns during the Chinese Civil War, 1927 to 1935, used German generals who commanded during World War I to command his forces. The real story, of course, is why American threats against Iran, Korea, and Venezuela, not Asian, we admit, but the lesson applies there as well, are nuts. Let's add to the group Afghanistan. In a White House conference with Pakistan's Imran Khan, Trump announced he could win the war in Afghanistan in 10 days. He said he wouldn't do it, but according to news reports, the Pentagon commanders had presented Trump with a plan to do exactly that. What wasn't reported is that the plan presented involved the use of 3 dozen thermonuclear weapons used on the civilian population, something Trump confirmed to Cam when he stated that the Pentagon's plan would involve millions of civilian deaths. The Pentagon recommended a nuclear war in Afghanistan because the Taliban had handily defeated the U.S. for 19 years. The reason for that? America went into Afghanistan in 2001, supported by drug lord tribal leaders from Tajik and Uzbek minorities seen by Afghanistan's Pashtun majority as foreigners. Sadly, the Taliban, most former mujahideen, once allied with the U.S., never hated the U.S., but simply refused to be ruled by what they called puppets and dancing boys, imposed on them against their will. Do remember, General MacArthur was fired by Truman in April 1951 when he told the president that the Korea could not be held against the Chinese People Liberation Army without the use of nuclear weapons. The story was just repeated in Washington under Trump, though the lunatic or lunatics at the Pentagon, possibly General Joseph Dunford himself, are managing to hide from public scorn. Why are Trump's threats not just rhetoric, but empty rhetoric? Simply put, the U.S. lacks the resources to invade Iran, something the U.S. promises continually. America's regional allies, Saudi Arabia and UAE and Bahrain, have been fought to a virtual standstill by poorly armed rebels in Yemen. Additionally, those nations, through their military, is well financed but have no experience in real combat operations whatsoever and are subject to massive retaliation from Iran that would be minimally devastating. Moreover, any war in Iran would spread to an attack on Israel, one Israel is incapable of enduring without very heavy losses and the virtual erasure of America's military in Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, along with other naval vessels in the region. Similarly, America's threats against Venezuela are past empty. Here, it isn't the powerful military that Iran possesses, but rather that Venezuela is simply unreachable. You can't land on their coast, you can't approach from land, you can't drop paratroopers on a nation that has modern air defenses, and this is the real story behind Venezuela. In North Korea, America's attempts first to threaten and then to talk to death have led to, rather than disarmament, a military buildup. Here, worst of all, America chooses to ignore what goes on rather than openly admit humiliation. Admit it or not, the humiliation is noted around the world, some, as with Iran, same as with Iran, same as with Venezuela. This leaves the U.S. with its policy of economic war and starvation, one that led the U.S. to have Britain seize an Iranian oil tanker believed to be heading for Syria, a notion that needed oil to warm its homes last winter. You see, Syria's domestic oil supplies are currently being stolen by U.S.-backed Kurds and sold through Turkey, with money supporting the oligarchs of Erbil and their bankster allies. Similarly, America's embargo on Iranian oil has pushed oil prices up $20 per barrel, enriching America's own breed of oligarchs, long partnered with military contractors and the hedge fund billionaires who make up much of Trump's cabinet heads. There are endless secondary issues as well, some going back to the beginning of time, that seem to deem all institutions as corruptible. Throughout the Middle Ages, religious perception, crusades, and frenzies of mass murder driven by religious hysteria killed millions. The Industrial Revolution, combined with the spread of central banking and debt-based currencies, lead to centuries of war for profit that continue to its day. These concepts have survived, while those predicting the absence of mankind toward betterment through democracy and individual initiative have fallen to the wayside. Under the merciless regime of fractional reserve banking and the elimination of sovereign money, what we address here is the role military power plays when said power has. Though advances in technology become improbable, Once generals led armies from the front. Now generals are nameless bureaucrats and grocery clerks who lead nothing. Then we have the final and third part, also read up by Gordon Duff, published the 25th of July 2019, also off of journal.org, with the topic of Criminal Syndicates, Not Politics, Drives Middle East Wars. In 2015, I addressed a security conference in Damascus on the issue of organized crime syndicates and their relationship to the post-9/11 wars and so-called Arab Spring. Even in Damascus, efforts were made to stop the presentation, forcing me to go directly to Syria's Minister of Justice, Dr. Najm Hamad al-Hamad. Using terse tones, Dr. Najm ordered the conference extended at my request. With regional security officers and the media present, U.S. Army Colonel James Hankey, retired, and I addressed the conclave with Dr. Najm at my side. The effect was startling, and there are reasons for this. No one ever speaks the truth, not in public. There were repercussions from this, a poisoning attempt, an attempt to plant a kilo of heroin in our hotel room in Lebanon, a plot foiled by Veterans Today financial editor Mike Harris. That story hasn't ended, but worse still, it is no longer told, even in Syria. Let us review that message and see how it applies today. Syria. Currently, Syria is being looted by U.S.-backed Kurds, who have ethnically cleansed and seized not hundreds but thousands of square miles of oil and gas fields. fertile farmlands, and billions of dollars of industrial and commercial resources. Before that, Syria was looted openly by Turkish organized crime, something I reviewed in detail with the Syrian government, not just endless antiquities sold in London and New York, not quite sure if that's pronounced properly, but entire factories, machine tools, copper pipes from schools, anything that could be uprooted from areas supposedly under the control of ISIS and Al-Qaeda or the supposed Free Syrian Army were stolen. Heavy equipment was brought into Syria. Lines of trucks, even teams of engineers across a carefully guarded border under the watchful eye of the Turkish security services, full partnered with organized crime cartel, we traced to Ukraine, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and across Europe into the United States. In addition, thousands of oil trucks were brought into the region, mostly from the United States. Used tanker trucks were being brought in wholesale across the U.S. and loaded on transports at the port of Houston, shipped to Turkey. And one moment, everybody. And yes. And across the U.S. and loaded on transport at the port of Houston, shipped to Turkey, and from there transited to Iraq, Syria, to steal oil. Previous oil thefts, mostly by the U.S., had been using the Baqa-Cheyenne pipeline, looting Iraq's Kirkuk oil field, largest in the world, of up to $500 billion in oil during and after the U.S. occupation of Iraq. Mostly by Exxon and British Petroleum, aided by corrupt U.S. officials. Alex Powers, a Veterans Today bureau chief, served as assistant to Paul Bremer, U.S. appointed governor of Iraq, to allegedly oversee this process. I met with Iraqi officials while representing the United Nations over this issue as well. During this period, from my office in Erbil, everything was known. The reason we mention this is that there would have been no leading of Syrian oil, something moving into high gear at this writing, with the threat of the Syrian oil at the highest levels ever, without the precedent set by the US and Britain in Iraq from 2005 onward. The thrust of Syrian oil that began in 2012, hauled mostly by American trucks delivered into Syria and Iraq through Turkey, coincided, of course, with the renewed looting of the Kirkuk oil fields north and northeast of Baghdad. Problem is, when this oil was stolen from Iraq, the only road systems that would deliver this to refineries and the world market and the endless stream of thousands of trucks was through the city of Erbil itself, the capital of the Kurdish regional government. Then into ISIS-held Mosul, and from there north past the Turkish-held region inside Iraq and right into Turkey herself. What am I saying here? ISIS, powerful Turkish organizations, and the government of the KRG in Iraq were fully partnered with their massive thrust of resources taking place with the tact approval of the US and British military. This, of course, means the entire coalition effort against ISIS was fake. Fake then and fake now. ISIS was funded by Saudi Arabia and Qatar, openly aided by the Israeli Air Force and facilitated by many governments: Romania, Bulgaria, Ukraine, Georgia, Turkey, Jordan, Bahrain, and more, many more. Why? Our hypothesis shows the long partnership between multi-generational organized crime and governments, some controlled and some partnered with, that staged terrorism and organized wars as backdrop for criminal activities. Iraq. This isn't politics, it's organized crime, a mafia operating inside the Kurdish region, working in concert with the Turkish mafia, who has long partnered with what is called the Kosher Nostra, the oligarchs, who run much of the world's organized crime from Trump's towers in New York, from the city of London, where they own banks, from Ukraine and across the world. The government in Baghdad, with U.S. cash flowing into key Sunni politicians, remain divided and helpless. I met with security officials in Baghdad in January 2014 to discuss the threat of ISIS. Several I spoke with assured me ISIS was easy to use and control. Months later, most of those I had spoken with had been beheaded. No one was prepared for the level of oil theft planned under ISIS. Until stopped by Russian aerospace forces, this stream of trucks stealing oil from Syria and Iraq was so large it would have been visible using only the naked eye from the surface of the moon, and by a small telescope from Mars. Yet the endless fleet of American surveillance drones saw nothing? Why? American lawmakers were receiving their share, paid into their campaign funds through dummy corporations allowed by highly controversial Supreme Court decisions. Citizens United v. Federal Election Commission 2005, and through accounts in the Cayman Islands under the auspices of a former American presidential candidate. In 2012, a former FBI agent brought me the files on these payoffs and submitted to a video debriefing outlining billions paid to U.S. officials. That video was erased from YouTube but still exists on Vimeo. It was offered to Moliere investigators during an interview at FBI headquarters. They did not except for reasons unknown. The same rat line used to launder funds to pay off Congress also launders cash from the drug cartels of Mexico and Colombia as well, directly into the U.S. political system, and manages a flow of cash from Afghanistan as well. Afghanistan. When the U.S. took over the nation beginning in late 2001, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld presented evidence that Al-Qaeda had vast underground cities across Afghanistan, housing tens of thousands of terrorists. He presented his evidence on NSNBD to anchor Tim Russert. The video of this farce, located here. Of course, the dozens of bases never existed. But America's transition of Afghanistan from a drug-free nation to a nation of addicts, a nation that is the world's largest producer of processed heroin that exists to this day. In a 2009 interview with a former SEAL team commander and a regional director for but the largest American contractor in the regime at the time, I was told the U.S. was using Global Hawk long-range drones like the one Iran shot down in July 2019 over the Straits of Hormuz to move heroin to Europe and the U.S. Veterans Today editors Colonel James Hankey and Mike Harris were with me during that exchange. The money trail for this heroin led not only through Mexico and the Cayman Islands to key U.S. officials, but through Switzerland as well, and paid officials in Afghanistan, former officials in Pakistan, key members of Israel's Likud party, and funded extremist organizations across Europe. The United States. The recent Epson scandal in the U.S. has had some startling repercussions as well. With the wealth of allegations yet unproven, supposedly tying large numbers of American officials to a child sex ring run by a foreign intelligence agency, a very real issue of Epstein's mysterious wealth was revealed useful information. Tracing his key financial backer, we stumbled upon a long-time partnership with the Gambino crime family in New York, and from there developed inextricable ties to historical figure Meyer Lansky. A fascinating background piece published by MintpressNews outlines the American roots of the organized crime network that highly informed sources say is manifested in ISIS and some of the right-wing movements in Europe as well. The article cites how prohibition, a law enacted in the U.S. in 1919, led to a major Canadian smuggling operation, bringing liquor into the U.S. The massive funding from this linked Canadian crime family, the Brofmans, to murder Incorporated's Myers Lansky's and allegedly ties them both to FBI founder J. Edgar Hoover, the CIA founder Alan Dulles, making both organizations at some level at least rooted in the Kosher Nostra, and possibly tying them to the assassination of John and Robert Kennedy, and certainly tying them to Iran-Contra and the massive criminal conspiracy that swept the American government under President Reagan. That trail from the 1920s leads to Roy Cohen, former legal counsel for alleged sex blackmail victim and Red Baiter Senator Joseph McCarthy. By the late 1960s, disgraced Cohen had moved into a powerful New York law firm, aided by former CIA Director Alan Dulles. Note that it was Dulles who John Kennedy fired as CIA Director, who headed the Warren Commission, which investigated Kennedy's murder. In 1975, the House Select Committee on Assassinations officially disregarded the Warren Commission report, citing that John Kennedy was killed by person or persons unknown, something now censored from American history from Mint Press. The Roy Cohn machine. Roy Cohn was only at the beginning of his career when he waded his way into the underground sexual blackmail ring, apparently led by Louis Rosenstiel. Indeed, when Cohn first met Hoover, he was only 23 years old. Over the next 3 decades or so before his death from AIDS-related complications in 1986 at the age of 56, Cohn built a well-oiled machine. Largely through his close friends, was some of the country's most influential figures. Among Cohn's friends were top media personalities like Barbara Walters, former CIA directors Ronald Reagan and wife Nancy, media moguls Rupert Murdoch and Mort Zuckerman, numerous celebrities, prominent lawyers like Alan Dershowitz, top figures in the Catholic Church, and leading Jewish organizations like B'nai B'rith and the World Jewish Congress. Many of the same names that surrounded Cohn until death in the late 1980s would later come to surround Jeffrey Epstein, with their names later appearing in Epstein's now infamous Little Black Book. While President Trump is clearly connected to both Epstein and Cohn, Cohn's network also extends to former President Bill Clinton, whose friend and longtime political advisor Richard Dirty Dick Morris was Cohen's cousin and close associate. Morris was also close to Clinton's former communications director, George Stephanopoulos, who is also associated with Jeffrey Epstein. Yet there were only Cohen's connections to respectable members of the establishment. He was also known for his deep connections to the mob and gained prominence largely for his ability to connect key figures in the criminal underworld to respected, influential figures acceptable to the public sphere. Ultimately, as New York Attorney John Cloet stated, Cohen's most powerful tool was blackmail, which he used against friend and foe, gangster or public official alike. How much of that blackmail he acquired through his sexual blackmail operation was likely never to be known. Ray Cohn, of course, was Donald Trump's mentor, constant companion, and legal representative until Cohen's death. Conclusion. It is clear that the political process of the United States, Great Britain, and Israel are interlocked under the control of multi-generational organized crime. It is also clear that security agencies of these nations have chosen to seek funding through illegal arms and narcotic sales, and that activities of these agencies have become inconsistent with their appointed tasks. You see, if seeking black funding is allowed, and it is, without limit, then security agencies, even military commands, and, as it follows, governments become criminal organizations. Their actions, psychological warfare, massive lie machines to cover their activities, endless corruptions, complicity in war for profit, false flag terrorism, manipulation of world markets, rigging elections, even rewriting history, must be considered as factual and real. Failure to do so blinds and cripples any government, any organization, any people who attempt to resist. Then worse, so much worse, a re-examination of history in this light then questions everything: events, wars, historical figures. Is any of it real? A note: the Whitney Webb 3-part expose of organized crime tentacles and dirty methods that reach deeply into the most powerful sectors of Western society, e.g. politics, intelligence, military, corporate banking, business, and media, is the most explosive story to break since WikiLeaks exposed the empire's war crimes. Highly recommended read. I hope you enjoyed this 3-part write-up by Kemo Sabi News. And it'd be great if you leave me with some comments. Awesome if you subscribed. And great if you'd hit that bell. Well, I suppose it's news if you consider it news. Yeah. Let me know what you thought of that. Definitely very interesting. And yeah, we're gonna get that all up there for you. We'll see you in the next one, everybody. Thanks a lot. Bye.